At this point, it would be a surprise if the Chicago Bears don't trade the number one pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. So now the question becomes when, not if.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, we look at the timeline for when the Chicago Bears will trade this number one overall pick in the 2023 draft. The question has sort of shifted from will they stay or will they go, and now it's when will they go. And it feels like Ryan Poles is being very intentional about turning the heat up now on all of their potential trade partners, because you may have noticed the Bears general manager is doing a little bit of a media blitz right now that feels very intentional to me. We'll talk about some of that and what timeline we could look like for some of these other teams then. We talked a little bit yesterday about when the Bears might want to and why they might want to do it now versus later, but we have to look at some of the other considerations that other teams will be looking at besides just what they want to do in free agency, and we'll kind of get a sense of what are some of the likely or less likely outcomes here for the Bears in terms of when this trade actually gets pulled off. But it stood out to me on Monday that Ryan Poles gave not only some prominent interviews to some prominent journalists, but was quite revelatory in those interviews, was very loose-lipped and willing to give out more specifics and more details than we had heard him give out at any point up to this point. Ryan Poles is not a general manager we tend to hear a ton from. He does his end of the season press conference. He and Matt Eberflus both did press conferences at the Combine. They'll both do draft day press conferences. They both do training camp press conferences, right? But he's not a big time talker all the time. I don't think he's dodging the media. He's just not a guy who goes out of his way to talk to the media. Now, at the NFL Scouting Combine, he went around and did a few different shows, and that's a time that's kind of a media day time, and he does it to sort of maintain relationships, and kind of good PR and good public image to go on different shows and different interviews. But across the spectrum, he was at a press conference, he was on CHGO, he was on NBC Sports, he was on the Rich Eisen show. He and Matt Eberflus were kind of all over the place, and across all those interviews, they were very sort of coy on details. We're exploring all options. We're looking at trading the pick. We're also considering taking it. We have some different options here. We're big fans of Justin Fields, but we are doing our due diligence right there. We're kind of leaving all the options out there and not really giving you a ton of specifics to nibble on. But on Monday, we got an interview with Peter King, and we got an interview with Albert Breer. And in both interview stories, Ryan Poles opened up, said, we're engaged in these conversations with multiple teams right now. He said, we've got a really good chance here to get a first-round pick in 2023, 2024, and 2025 to get 2 future first-round picks in this trade-down scenario. He starts getting really specific about, not perfectly specific, but more specific than we had seen up to this point, despite all the other interviews he'd been doing. All of a sudden now, he gets more specific about compensation and some of the things they're hearing from teams, the number of teams he's hearing from. He also told Albert Breer that he's evaluated about 7 guys that he thinks would be worthy of the number one overall pick. Like, he's starting to give you some of these details, despite being asked a lot of these same questions just last week at these press conferences. Now he's ready to spill a little bit more and give a little bit more details. And I find myself doing the Brian Windhorst, lean back, finger up in the air. Now, why is that? Why would it be that now, after the combine wraps up, Ryan Poles is ready to go a little bit more public on some of these details? Is he just being nice and friendly and transparent? Or is he intentionally going to two of the most prominent national NFL writers in the media space that have a long history of good sourcing within organizations and often get good stories that they don't even report, because he knows other teams are going to read those stories. People are going to read Albert Breer's MMQB and Peter King's Football Morning in America. And not just readers like you and me, but other teams are going to see those quotes and see those stories. More so than, like, GMs are not going to necessarily sit down and everyone's going to watch Ryan Poles' press conference, right? GMs aren't necessarily going to sit down and tune in even to like the Rich Eisen show or some of the other shows that we mentioned, right? Like they're not keeping tabs on some of the specific shows like that, but these kind of prominent football columns are legacy media that teams pay attention to. And it feels to me very intentional that Ryan Poles does these interviews, puts out even more specifics so that every other team who's negotiating with him will see that, okay, other teams seem to be offering this. The Bears seem to be going after that. They seem to have specific needs. And here's the kind of competition I'm facing as another GM trying to get to that number one overall pick. And it's Ryan Poles being particularly loud intentionally to say, hey, everybody, let's get this rolling. Let's heat this up a little bit. Step up your offers. Here's how you can, I'm going to give you all a hint on what the bidding wars look like. And I'm going to make sure that you all know what this competition looks like so that you can really give me your best offers and I can then get the best possible deal that I can for my number one overall pick. It just feels, the timing feels very intentional because the combine is where these discussions really get started and start to solidify. And now Poles says, hey, we're talking compensation. We're talking specific teams. We're ironing out some details right now on what a trade might look like. That's his sign that says, hey, if you're in my negotiations, I'm in those same negotiations with other teams, so you better step up. And if you're not one of those teams that's ironing out details with me right now, then you better, because I'm going to just pick one of these other teams. If you want in on this sweepstakes, get in now because we are honing in on some of the details here. Now, does that mean a trade is going to happen tomorrow? I'm guessing probably not quite that quick, but we could still see a trade happen even in the next week. And we'll kind of go through why maybe not right away, but soon-ish feels like the right time because more so of what the other teams still need to do before they agree to a trade with the Bears, as opposed to what the Bears need to do before they'll give away the number one overall pick. That's next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's number one sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets right back to you if your first bet doesn't win. So you're guaranteed, win or lose with your first bet, you get to play again and get that money back in bonus bets. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And just because we're in the NFL offseason doesn't mean there isn't football for you to bet on with FanDuel. There's XFL games, but also the NFL draft. You can bet on who the first overall pick will be, who the first quarterback will be, who the first wide receiver will be, and so much more. Plus, the NBA season heading to the playoffs right around the corner, the NHL season, and so much more at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL and NBA. We sit here today and feel like, all these NFL teams, at least a few of them are going to want to get to the number one pick and would like to know now whether or not they're going to have the number one overall pick, to know whether or not they're going to be able to get the quarterback that they want in the NFL draft. But I also think there is more to this that maybe we should slow down a little bit. I think Ryan Poles, one of these days I'm going to quit doing that. Ryan Poles is intentionally turning the heat on now. And I think Ryan Poles does really want to have a deal done now. I think he's looking at free agency and saying, if I'm going to get a player in these trades, I need that player now so I know whether or not to sign more players at that position. And if I'm going to trade down, I need to know how far I'm going to trade down, because that will determine perhaps what player I think will be available to me, or what players will be available to me at my new pick, which could potentially shape how I may want to go about the money I spend in free agency. Like if I think my favorite wide receivers will be there at 7 or 9 or 4, or if my favorite edge rusher will be there at 4 but not at 9, depending on which team ends up making the trade down, could influence a little bit of how Ryan Poles feels like he needs to spend his free agent dollars to put him in the most flexible position to draft the best player available with wherever his first round pick will be. But that's also an assumption that all the other teams are fully ready, or the trade needy quarterback teams are ready to commit to their quarterback being the number 1 overall pick. And it's important to keep in mind how that process goes for them. That yes, all of these teams will have finished their tape evaluation on these players and will have a pretty good sense of the guy they really like. But if we remember back to when the Bears drafted Justin Fields, or before that when the Bears drafted Mitch Trubisky, and we hear about drafting the quarterback process, right? And pretty early on in the process, perhaps you fall in love with your guy, a guy on tape, and you're like, wow, we think this is probably going to be the one. But you still have to meet with them at the NFL Scouting Combine, have your coaches talk to this person and find out, are they the right person, the right brain, the right quarterback between the ears off the field, and how they handle themselves in meetings, and all these things that are really important in determining who you're going to not only draft as your franchise quarterback, but in this case, in 2023, give up significant draft capital to move up to the number 1 overall pick to make this quarterback your franchise quarterback. So you have to be, you always have to be really sure when you're going to draft a quarterback in the first round, but you almost have to be like that much more extra sure. If you're presumably going to give up multiple future first round picks, as Ryan Poles keeps putting out there, to get this quarterback, you have to check all the boxes, cross all of your T's, and dot all of your I's. So that includes meeting with the quarterback at the combine. That includes getting their medical evaluations at the combine and being able to now take what you just got at the combine and assess those and weigh those with these quarterbacks that can maybe change how you might feel about a quarterback, or if there was a guy you were in love with, but there's a real red flag there that wasn't otherwise available to you, maybe that changes the level of urgency you have to trade up for a quarterback. And there's also the private workout. That's a really big part of this process. And I feel like when we heard about it with, guys like Fields, and I remember specifically with Trubisky, right? That was a big part of the process of falling in love with them, is having your coaches and or GMs at their private workouts, either in your facility or wherever that happens. It doesn't always have to be the pro day. You don't have to wait to the pro day, but to have that one-on-one private workout to really kind of confirm, yes, this is our guy. And given that we're at March 7th as this podcast comes out, teams haven't had, teams are just getting a chance to fully evaluate the medicals and the combine stuff, and haven't yet had much time to get these guys in their buildings for private workouts. And maybe that could be a team saying, hey, listen, we really like quarterback blank, Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young, but we really need to see him work out with our coaches, interact with them in that practice setting in our building before we're willing to really pull the trigger and give up maybe 3 first-round picks or whatever to get up to number 1 to take this guy. And I think Ryan Poles is trying to push them and pressure them and say, do you like these quarterbacks or not? Get them done, because if you're not willing to do it now, the Panthers are, or the Colts are, this other team is. So I'm going to keep putting info out there. I'm going to turn the heat up and say, even if, it's like, all right, guys, you got your combine numbers, you got your medicals, you got to meet with them at the combine. Do you really need the private workout, or can we just get this going? Let's get one of these teams to pop from the pressure that he keeps putting on there, because I really do think, Poles is trying to play it cool. You see these quotes where he's saying, we don't have to trade it early. And if we do trade it early, it's going to cost a premium because, it's really an early time to trade it. So teams are going to have to give up extra to trade. And who knows, maybe we could even still hold on to it until draft day, or we could even keep it and, take somebody with the number 1 overall pick. Maybe we don't even want to trade it after all. But at the same time, he says there's over a 50% chance that we trade it. That to me sounds like a GM who really wants to go into free agency, knowing at least where the first trade will be. Perhaps there could be a second trade if he goes to 2 or 4. We'll see kind of how the market might play out from there. But the second trade wouldn't happen until draft day, depending on what order the other quarterbacks might go. I mean, if he's at 2, right, not the point of the discussion today, but the more point being, he wants to know what kind of draft capital he's going to have and where his next first-round pick will actually be once he makes that trade before he gets into free agency. And he feels like maybe he can squeeze a little bit more out of teams by doing it now ahead of free agency and ahead of more of these quarterback dominoes starting to fall, because that's really the other side of what the Bears are waiting for here and what other teams may be waiting for here. We finally got the Derek Carr domino to fall. We finally got Geno Smith domino to fall here. We're on the precipice of a Lamar Jackson franchise tag set to happen today at the franchise tag deadline, but whether that leads to a trade or not is not really the conclusion that we've been able to reach just yet. But it kind of leads to a scenario here where either it feels like the trade's either going to happen really soon, like in the next 7 days, or it's going to wait a little bit until after more of this plays out for both the Bears and some of these other teams. We'll go through why it might happen now and why it might happen later next on Locked On Bears. Let's start with this trade happening sooner rather than later. Like, the more media attention, the more Ryan Poles seems to be very intentionally putting information out there and not even hiding it. We didn't mention that too. Like, it's not just like Adam Schefter reporting an anonymous source. This is like Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus putting our name on it. We want these picks. We're talking to some teams. We're ready to roll. Let's see these offers, essentially, is what they're saying. What makes it happen here sooner rather than later, first and foremost, I think, is quarterback dominoes falling. We talked about this a little bit on yesterday's podcast, but within the next 7 days, I would think we should get an Aaron Rodgers answer or a direction there. I think within the next 7 days, we should get a sense of Lamar Jackson, whether he's going to play on the franchise tag or stay in Baltimore for some way, shape, or form, or whether they'll just say, screw it, we can't reach a deal. You know, two sides seeking a trade there. Or I guess he could become a non-exclusive franchise tag where he could negotiate with other teams and give the Ravens a chance to match and gain 2 first-round picks, right? We'd start to get some of those answers, as we were already getting the Derek Carr and Geno Smith answers. The Seahawks were maybe a dark horse team to trade up. If they didn't re-sign Geno Smith, they would have needed a quarterback and could have been a potential trade-up team. They're off the board. I think it's likely they still draft a quarterback, even with Geno Smith under contract, but they paid him a 3-year, basically a 2-year guaranteed deal. I don't think they're going to trade all their assets to one to get a quarterback and not try and build around Geno Smith a little bit more directly. They'd give up all those future first-round picks or whatever it would take to get from 5 to 1. There's also, I guess, Jimmy Garoppolo is the real, like, free agent that's going to be left as far as a guy who could just kind of go anywhere he wants in that regard. And maybe if the 49ers look to trade Trey Lance, or there have been Mac Jones murmurings, but right, it feels to me like those things will start to fall into place pretty quickly. And we're going to have more quarterback needy teams than veteran quarterbacks. And one or two of these teams are going to be stuck looking around and saying, oh, these veteran quarterbacks are gone. We didn't get one. We got to go get our rookie and make sure we get the guy we really want. And maybe that's the Houston Texans when it's all said and done, just going from 2 to 1. Maybe that's the deal the Bears end up looking at, because Ryan Poles is not necessarily coming out and saying, we're going to take whichever team offers us the most total number of draft picks, but it's more about the best offer for how far down you're going to move. And he talked about how, we still want a blue chip player in this draft class. So if we're going to move down far enough to miss out on some of the blue chip players in this draft class, then the compensation is going to need to be even greater, as opposed to moving from 2 to 1 with the Texans and not missing out on any of the blue chip prospects that you would have wanted. So the compensation wouldn't need to be nearly as great comparatively to what the Raiders or the Panthers or the Titans or the Commanders or whoever might want to move all the way up, even higher up in this draft. You could also see teams looking around and saying, okay, the Jimmy Garoppolo goes to New York or wherever, and Aaron Rodgers goes to Vegas or retires or whatever, and, some of these dominoes start to fall into place. And then, a team like the Colts are sitting there saying, well, at 4, we've got a pretty good shot here because we know the Cardinals aren't going to take a quarterback, and the Texans may or may not, but we still kind of feel like there's a couple guys we could like. And maybe the Panthers are sitting there saying, hey, we're not quite as sold on some of these quarterbacks here. Do we have to make sure we trade up and get that guy? They were going to bring back Sam Darnold. They still have PJ Walker, and they drafted Matt Corral in the 3rd round last year. Right? I'm not saying that it's going to keep them from drafting a quarterback altogether, but some of these teams can say, screw it, I'm not going to let Ryan Poles bully me and pressure me, and especially as if some of these other quarterback trade up teams come off the market, if the Raiders say, yeah, we're taking Jimmy Garoppolo and not going to trade up for a quarterback there, and if Aaron Rodgers goes to the Panthers for some reason, right? That was a team that was reportedly reaching out to Green Bay in that conversation, and then all of a sudden maybe there's an advantage to a team like the Colts or whoever playing the long game and saying, well, let's see where these quarterbacks go to some of these other teams. We're not really interested, or maybe we can pretend to be interested to drive up the price for other teams. And maybe we'll look around and say, yeah, we're one of the last teams left making an offer. And so then our offer doesn't have to be as big, and there doesn't have to be as much bidding in that regard. And it'll still be a good offer for the Bears, but it's not going to be this extravagant desperation type move just to get past some of these other teams that could ultimately end up getting more quarterback options in place. We talked about a little bit about the quarterback carousel on a podcast. Was it in January or was it in February? It was definitely at least last month, a few weeks ago, if you want to think about more of the specifics of which quarterbacks could be available to go to which potential quarterback-needy teams. But it's important to keep in mind, Albert Breer pointed this out in his Sports Illustrated article, over the last 20 drafts, the top picks within the top 3 have been traded 8 times. Those trades happened on, 3 of them were on draft day, and then the other 5 were March 9th, March 17th, March 26th, April 14th, and April 20th. In that vein, I wouldn't expect the trade to necessarily happen earlier than March 9th. The franchise tag deadline day today will be a big step forward, but I don't think it's going to be like tags are applied, boom, Bears make a deal back to back, right? I think it's going to be like, okay, tags are applied, negotiations heat up, and a date like March 9th could be an accelerated time there, but it feels more like, March 13th is when the free agent negotiation window opens up. March 15th is when the new league year officially starts, which is kind of when, essentially when the trade would actually go into effect, but they can negotiate it earlier up to this point. And so, that feels more like the timeline. If it's going to happen before free agency, I don't know why it would need to happen now as opposed to March 12th, right? Like what is the difference doing it now versus 5 days later and closer to free agency? It feels like that's more like the timeline. That's why I feel like 7 days is kind of the window I'm in. It's like it's probably going to happen either in the next week or we have to wait for a lot to happen in free agency and see things kind of play out to there. And that's when you get more into like March 26th, April 14th, April 20 type dates where trades have happened. Because again, April is kind of when these teams finalize those private workouts that we talked about. Like they want to see these quarterbacks in their building and make sure that they're really sold on these guys and go through all of their background checks and talking to their high school coaches and their neighbors on their street growing up, like all the crazy stuff teams do to look into prospects. They haven't quite had enough time to do just yet. So it's easy for me to see a scenario where teams do wait, but the fact that Ryan Poles is putting on so much media pressure right now suggests to me he's really pushing to get a deal done now and trying to put the pressure on other teams to make them desperate and not just him desperate to get a deal done now because he wants it done now, but get them to be the ones that are desperate to get the deal done now so he can also get then the best return on his investment. Because at the end of the day, he can't afford to wait as long as he wants. I mean, he could wait till draft day to trade the number 1 overall pick, and it's not going to drastically affect the Bears' plans. It's other teams whose plans will be more affected by what pick they think they have, as opposed to the Bears, who, at the end of the day, it's not going to overhaul their whole free agency plan if they're drafting at 4 instead of 1 or 7 or 9 instead of 1. But it would be nice to know. But it's more of a nice to know thing as opposed to these other teams that need to know who their quarterback is going to be. And that's where Ryan Poles is really turning up the heat. I'm excited to see when this may all come together for the Bears. It feels like every day is dangerous because maybe by the time I post this podcast or you listen to it in the morning or whenever it might be, maybe the trade has already happened and the podcast will feel like it's a day late. But hey, that's the nature of the beast, and that's why we love off-season football here on Locked On Bears. It's why you have to subscribe to make sure you're keeping up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis wherever you get your podcasts and on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Make sure you make us your first listen again tomorrow. We're going to talk about some of the aftermath of the franchise tag deadline. Guys no longer hitting the free agent market. A couple of big names at running back, a big name that has already escaped me. We already know Deron Payne at defensive tackle, but there was another one that, a big name tight end as well, and some other players that had, and also players not franchise tagged, who ends up not getting the tag and hitting the open market and getting us a more concrete idea of who will be available and who will not for your Chicago Bears. So come on back tomorrow for how the franchise tag deadline will affect the Bears' free agency plan. And then before you know it, this draft trade is going to be coming at some point, and we'll break it all down for you here on the podcast. So appreciate you tuning in to Locked On Bears each and every day, and I hope you'll come back tomorrow for another opportunity to bear down.